Welcome to the Financial Architects Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Makovsky, joined by partner and chief investment officer, Larry Steinberg. Larry, before we get into this, I see the red and the blue. You want to show us the entire flag? I know you're celebrating a USA hockey gold medal.
Yes, I have lots of Canadian friends, and I had to rub it in a little bit. You know, the men and women won in hockey. I'm a hockey fan. Kudos to the U.S. men and women's hockey teams for the double gold medals. Pretty much the only thing in the Olympics I even watched.
I'm actually not that far apart from you on that. Larry, they say, may you live in interesting times, and we are definitely in interesting times. I don't remember a time so rife with strife. We have cities that have devolved into open violence. We are seeing a great many companies and individuals move, and we have this strange dichotomy in our educational system where schools literally fall into one of two camps, and if you dare hold contrary positions, you could be fired or expelled. What's your take on all this mayhem?
Well, I mean, is this fundamentally different than what the country went through in like the 1960s? There was a lot of upheaval then, and we got to the other side. One thing I think is that people may be paying more attention than ever before to what's going on with the government and what's going into the country, and I think that could actually be a good thing. We want people to pay attention and know what's going on and be informed. Focusing on what our government is doing at all levels, I think, is actually good for society. There's really no trust, and I think that may actually be a positive, that we want to verify that the people are actually acting in our best interests. The one thing I'll really point out is that, every generation says the younger generation is, they don't get it, they don't understand. I have a parent of two young adults, or I guess technically my son won't be an adult until May, but that's when he turns 18. And I think that a lot of this younger generation will surprise you, just like kind of me as a Gen X surprised my boomer dad oftentimes. I think that they feel we're not, that the boomers felt that Gen X was detached and lazy and, wasn't capable of doing things. And I think the reality was very different. So I think this next generation is going to surprise us.
I know you don't judge people based on their politics, but do politics even matter in the world of investing?
I would say that, I've changed. I actually do find myself judging people on their politics these days. I kind of feel like I'm forced to. And I kind of feel like a lot of people who are on the extremes are people I just don't want to deal with in my life, either as clients or friends or anything like that. There's so many people that are judgmental that if you don't have the same views as them, they don't want to deal with you. And so that's fine. That's your loss. And I think a lot of people don't think about their positions. They're just emotional. I really don't have time for those people in my life, whether it's business or personal, either these days. The reality is actually that whereas I would have said, when I started my career 30 plus years ago, that politics wasn't that important when it came to finance and economics, I think that it's hugely critical right now. I think politics and really geopolitics are something that you have to look at first in your investing strategies and not last. I mean, these are the policies that are creating the debt, quantitative easing, quantitative tightening policies. Interest rates are all over the place. And the governments really affect, who you can lend to and why and under what circumstances, right? I think that the politics is creating bubbles in some areas and deflating industries in another. And I think that a lot of this is causing a mass migration of capital out of the U.S. and out of technology to more international investments and into hard assets. And if you're not paying attention to that, if you think that you can do things the way you did 5 or 10 years ago, I think that you're missing the boat. And I think that your investment strategy isn't going to do well. And I think your financial planning and tax strategy isn't going to do well unless you understand the politics and really the geopolitics right now. One thing I think people aren't paying a lot of attention to that is super critical is supply chains. Energy is very important. The entire world operates on energy, and energy is a tool of the global trade war, and it's a tool of actual war. The pushback on Russia, with the Ukraine war right now, it's like they're finally being serious about pushing back on Russia by going after the shadow fleet of tankers, and the same with Iran. the world governments are finally saying like, oh yeah, we've got a embargo. You can't buy Russian or Iranian oil. But they allowed these shadow fleets to move it all around the world. And they didn't want to mess with that because they didn't want to push oil prices up. But all of a sudden, in the last couple of weeks, the U.S. and I think one other country have now interdicted and stopped shadow fleet tankers. And I think that'll put a pressure on Russia and Iran to come to the table and hopefully, change. That I think is super important. So energy is something that is critical. That's a huge part of the supply chain. And if you don't have a plan thinking about what happens if, oil prices spike or if natural gas prices spike, then you're missing the boat and you can't be investing in some of these other areas, especially technology. Artificial intelligence runs off power. If energy prices are high, that investment isn't going to be as good. And there's a lot going on there. I also think that one of the things that we've learned that is super important and is affected by these geopoliticals is how vulnerable we are. I mean, in COVID, you saw that entire industries got shut down. Like literally, you couldn't buy a new car, and the entire car was built except for the computer chip in it they didn't have. And without the computer chip, the car didn't run. Those people in real estate and commercial real estate saw that you'd finish real estate projects, except that it was multi-story building and you couldn't get the elevator parts out of China, and so entire projects were ground to a halt and couldn't be advanced because they couldn't get done because there's no elevators. You couldn't put in the elevators, so you had things that opened up 6, 9, 12 months late. And when you're building a building and you're trying to rent it out, doesn't matter if you can't put an elevator in and it's more than 3 stories, then you can't rent it out. And then your entire project is going to be delayed. And that literally elevator parts literally killed commercial projects and put them into bankruptcy.
Larry, clarify something though at the top here for your statement. Just quickly, I don't want to pull you off on a tangent, but you said basically politics do affect kind of the way you maybe take on or I don't want to misquote you, but interact with clients. You're a big sports guy. I have a sports background. You look in the past, whether it's, black issues where you look at like Muhammad Ali was very active. So was Bill Russell. Whereas you look at Michael Jordan, I don't know if this is the exact quote, so forgive me, but like he used to say, Republicans buy sneakers too, meaning he stayed out of politics. So did Tiger Woods, more or less, stayed out of politics. Now they were selling a product. You sell a service. I can't think that you won't take on a client who doesn't align with you completely politically. I'm asking you to maybe clarify that statement.
The issue is that it doesn't matter what somebody's politics are. I'm going to try to do the best job I can for them. But it's really difficult sometimes when people have extreme views and that affects how they want me to do my job, right? So an example would be that, we're very heavy on the energy side and doing oil and gas projects, right? And investing there. If you are so against fossil fuels that you will not allow me to put those investments in, even though I can show you how they're actually much better for the environment than, what you're thinking they are. I mean, we pull energy out of the ground much cleaner here in the U.S. than they do anywhere else in the world. And that includes Canada, by the way. We're much cleaner in our energy production than Canada is. Well, if you take that tool, it makes it very difficult for me to get the investment results that I want for you. And maybe that's a reason why I haven't taken on clients, is if you're going to take that tool out of my pocket based on your political viewpoint, then, I can't operate with one hand tied behind my back. And also just from a, emotional standpoint, it's tough to deal with people that are so into politics that, you can't talk about anything normal, right? You can't talk, it always, goes into, to that way, like from an emotional standpoint, I just can't do that anymore, right? So it's not that I won't take somebody on, but in order to do the best job for somebody, they got to let me use all my tools. And from an emotional standpoint, I just don't need to talk about, what they do like or don't like about a president or a party or anybody else. But the biggest part of that is if your political leanings, put it in me in a place where I can't do what I do, then it's better that I move on and just deal with somebody else. because at the end of the day, I'm a very pro-environment guy. But I think that the politicking around the environment and, a lot of the way that is manifesting itself is actually not really pro-environment. It's more about, people's views on how the world economics can work than anything else. And that's not, productive. And that's not going to allow me to get them to financial freedom.
I understand in short and clear terms, if their politics are going to affect your investment strategy for them, then they're not the right client for you.
Correct. I need to have all my tools.
Okay. What are you talking about? The lack of the chip shortage during the pandemic with the cars. So, things aren't fully up to speed in the U.S. So what do we do? Do we relocate?
Well, so here's the analogy I would give there, right? Things are actually, on a political standpoint, way worse in just about any other part of the world you go to. I mean, as bad as things are here, in Britain, you can go to jail for a tweet, right? In Canada, you can have your bank account taken away for protesting, right? In other parts of the world, a lot of which are in the Middle East, if you have a belief that goes contrary to the people running the country, you can get thrown off a building, right? These are much bigger problems than, like, in California, they're not going to allow us to buy a gas-powered car after 2030. We'll see if that actually happens, right? But it's an order of level. So the reality is that, as tough as things are here, I think it's really worse in a lot of the rest of the world. There is no utopia. There is no panacea. And, the leaving the U.S., we've heard all these people have left the U.S., and, you hear them move to these other parts of the world. And, there was one, like, social media influencer who decided to move to Russia because it was going to be so much better. And she ended up getting beaten because of the color of her skin in the apartment building she was in. And you also hear about all these people that have moved to Canada, and you think inflation's bad here and cost of living is bad here. It's substantively worse in Canada. Housing prices are much less affordable in Canada. So people have moved to Canada and their standard of living has dropped precipitously and their taxes have gone up, and then they're complaining about how bad it is there. So don't think that as bad as things are here, that there's some place you can move and make it easy.
Well, it still doesn't sound too good with the state of the U.S. So what to do?
Well, I mean, I think that you could draw a parallel between how economists talk about the U.S. and the politics in the U.S., which is that, I hear economists oftentimes say, well, the U.S. economy has all these problems, but it's the least dirty shirt. It's bad here, but it's worse, pretty much anywhere else. And so the way I look at it is democracy and capitalism can suck, but fascism sucks a lot worse, right? So because you can have people elected to office that do a bad job. I live in the Eaton fire zone, right? Like, literally the political choices got people killed and their homes burned down. But at least people aren't being arrested for their political opinions and put in jail, right? So, as bad as it is here, it's a lot worse, pretty much anywhere else.
So are you leaving California then? I heard $1 trillion of net worth left the state in December over proposed net worth tax.
Actually, that tax is a lot worse than they're actually talking about. Now, it hasn't been passed yet. It'll be on the November ballot. And they said that anyone that was a billionaire was going to have to give 5% of their net worth to the state of California to help it balance its budget. But if you look into the wording of that bill, like, literally that bill gives the state a right to say, oh, you know what, we're having financial difficulties, so we're just going to pass a net worth tax on anybody, right? And if you think about it, if they're going to do a net worth tax, then that gives them the right to audit your finances, right? The state is literally going to require you to say where all your money is and what it's invested in and what those values are. So that's pretty extreme. And that's why a lot of billionaires left the state in December, because they fear this tax coming in, because people don't understand. It's like, okay, let's just say that you have a lot of money, but it's in investments and it's in fixed assets and it's in businesses. It's not like you have 5% of your net worth sitting around in cash that you can write a check. Then you're gonna have to sell assets to pay that tax, right? But then when you sell those assets, it then triggers a lot more taxes, right? So yeah, it's not well thought out, and I think that it's bad, and it could be really bad. I'm not, I think, yet in the net worth category that I would get targeted, but so I'm not leaving, but that's a yet. I mean, I'm not gonna commit to being in California for forever.
Why? Why not? Why not just Ray Charles hit the road, Jack?
Because everyone thinks that, like, okay, you go to another state, it's going to be great there, right? It's the same thing we were talking about internationally. There's no utopia. If you leave one state for another, you're just going to really trade one set of problems for another set of problems, right? You're going to have, if you leave California, you're going to have actual weather. I've been on some college trips with my son. When it's 15 degrees out in the snow, we don't really get that in LA. You're going to have different kinds of political extremes, and just because the income tax is lower, other taxes are higher. Like, everyone thinks that Texas is a low tax state, but Texas just tax differently, right? They just attack your property taxes heavily rather than your income. So no income tax, but a heavy property tax. Now, you can argue about whether which one's better or worse, but the reality is it's not necessarily. And I'm not going to make the argument that taxes are as bad in Texas as they are in California. They aren't. The tax burden is much lower, but just because there's no income tax, it's not like you're getting a free ride. But, I'm going to be honest. I do believe at some point I probably will move, and probably for the reason that a lot of people are moving, but not the reason in the headlines. There's been some polling that shows that the number one reason people leave, people with assets leave California, is actually not taxes or regulations. That's why companies move, right? But individuals seem to be moving oftentimes especially when they get into retirement, to be close to their kids and grandkids, right? And, I think that at some point that will probably be what drives me to leave California, is a desire to be closer with my kids and family. And, my kids have indicated that, they're not necessarily going to stay in California after, when they become adults, because jobs and opportunities aren't there for, them or for their significant others. And, you'll see it. So I think that people that are leaving California and are leaving a lot of these states, companies are being driven up by taxes or regulation. People are leaving in order to be closer to family, and or alternately, some individuals are leaving because their jobs moved. That's why when you visit like Nevada or Arizona or Texas, you'll see people wearing T-shirts. Don't California my Arizona, Nevada, or Texas, because the people are voting the same way as they did in the prior state, and the people in the new state aren't necessarily fond of that, which is, trading one problem for another, like I talked before. But I really think that, I will eventually probably leave California, and it'll be based more on dealing with family than anything else, because at the end of the day, I can operate from anywhere. We have clients, all over the U.S. and internationally. So, there you go.
Well, there you have it. We live in a very imperfect world. And that's going to wrap things up for today's Financial Architects podcast. I am your host, Evan Makovsky. I want to thank Chief Investment Officer and Partner Larry Steinberg, and we will see you on the next episode.